Schopenhauer had no time for comforting illusions. For him, life was not a gift, but a disguised condemnation. We come into the world without having asked for it, thrown into an existence marked by suffering, insatiable desire, and the certainty that, in the end, everything ends in nothingness. There is no cosmic purpose, no written destiny that justifies the pain. There is only a blind force that pushes us to exist and makes us stumble again and again with the same disappointing reality. To live is to suffer. Remember to subscribe, activate the bell, and enjoy philosophy. From his vision of the world as an absurd game to his brutality in describing human relationships, Schopenhauer left no room for naive optimism. His philosophy does not seek to console, but to face the truth with the coldness of one who has seen too much. He reminds us that pleasure is fleeting, that happiness is just the pause between two misfortunes, and that, deep down, everything we do is try to distract ourselves from an unbearable reality. But he did not sink into absolute nihilism because of this. If life is a mistake, then the real challenge is learning to bear it with dignity. Few philosophers have been as mercilessly honest as he was. He didn't seek to save us, but to shake us, to tear the blindfolds from our eyes and show us that suffering is the only constant. And yet, in his darkness, there is a strange lucidity. Perhaps because, by accepting that life is a trap with no way out, it becomes easier to walk through it without ridiculous expectations. After all, if the world is a hostile place, all that remains is to learn to move through it intelligently. Schopenhauer's first lesson is simple and brutal. To live is to suffer. Not as a metaphor, not as a poetic exaggeration, but as an inescapable reality. From the moment we are born, we are condemned to experience pain, frustration, and disillusionment. Existence itself is an endless cycle of desires that are never fully satisfied, of needs that reappear just when we think we have resolved them. And the more aware we are of this, the more unbearable life becomes. Life oscillates, like a pendulum, between pain and boredom, Schopenhauer wrote in The World as Will and Representation. If we are not suffering from what we lack, we are bored of what we already have. There is no middle ground, no rest. People pursue goals thinking that happiness is on the other side of the finish line, but when they reach it, they only discover a new lack, a new emptiness. Even the most intense pleasure is ephemeral and leaves behind a trail of dissatisfaction. We want something, we get it, we get used to it, and we desire something else again. This continues until death. The most desperate thing is that there is no escape. Suffering is not an exception in life, it is its essence. We can disguise it with entertainment, with distractions, with self-help philosophies that tell us that everything depends on our attitude. But in the end, what Schopenhauer saw is that pain is not an accident of existence, but its fundamental condition. And all we can really do is learn to tolerate it. Schopenhauer's second lesson is even more devastating. Happiness is an illusion, not because it is unattainable, but because it is designed to be ephemeral. No matter how much we achieve, how much we accumulate, or how pleasurable our moments of joy are, they will always vanish into the air like smoke. We cling to the idea that happiness is a state we can reach and remain in, but Schopenhauer tells us this is a childish fantasy. In The World as Will and Representation, he made it clear that desire is the source of all dissatisfaction. We want and suffer, we obtain and get bored. We are never really satisfied because our nature forces us to want more. And when we get what we wanted, the emotion quickly dissolves, leaving us in a state of indifference, ready to seek a new goal that will give us back the sense of purpose. This is how we spend our lives, jumping from one yearning to another, convinced that next time we will find that permanent satisfaction that, in reality, never existed. Even people who seem to have achieved everything end up trapped in this trap. The millionaire who no longer knows what to buy, the artist who fears having reached their peak, the lover who realizes that passion wears out over time. Happiness is a mirage that recedes as soon as we believe we have reached it. The only constant is the emptiness it leaves behind. Schopenhauer's third lesson is that love is nothing more than a biological trap. There is nothing sublime in passion, nothing sacred in desire, nothing eternal in feelings. What we call love is nothing more than a mechanism of nature to ensure the reproduction of the species, an irrational force that dominates us and drags us without us realizing its true purpose. We believe we fall in love because we find someone special, someone unique, someone made for us, but what really happens is that the will to live, that blind and impersonal force, uses us as instruments to continue perpetuating itself. Schopenhauer wrote in Metaphysics of Sexual Love that love is a powerful illusion, designed to make us believe that we choose, when in reality, we are chosen by biology. We are attracted to certain people because, without knowing it, we look for characteristics that maximize the probability of strong and healthy offspring. No matter how much we idealize romance, in the end, everything comes down to an instinct disguised as deep emotion. And once its purpose has been fulfilled, desire fades, passion turns into habit, and what seemed like a magical union is revealed for what it really is. An impulse that has fulfilled its function and no longer has reason to exist. The cruelest thing is that we don't learn. We fall into the same trap over and over again, convinced that this time it will be different, that we have found something authentic and eternal. But Schopenhauer warns us that love is nothing more than a cruel joke of nature, a deception that keeps us moving, that makes us believe in the possibility of happiness only to snatch it away later. Schopenhauer's fourth lesson is that life has no purpose. There is no final goal, no glorious destiny awaiting us, no hidden meaning waiting to be discovered. All we do is simply exist, moved by an irrational force that compels us to move forward without offering us a clear reason for doing so. From the time we are born until we die, life is just a repetitive cycle of desires, frustrations, and suffering, with no definitive reward at the end of the road. In The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer explains that existence is dominated by the will, a blind and irrational force that drives us to continue living without asking why. There is no master plan, no benevolent God guiding us, no transcendental destiny that gives meaning to everything. There is only constant movement, an inertia that drags us without giving us the option to stop. Even those who believe they have found a purpose have actually fallen into an illusion that allows them to tolerate the anguish of existence. The irony is that, although life lacks purpose, we continue to act as if it had one. We set goals for ourselves, seek meaning in work, in love, in family, in anything that makes us feel there is a reason to be here. But Schopenhauer forces us to ask ourselves, what would happen if we stopped deceiving ourselves? If we once and for all accepted that life is just an accident with no direction or meaning? Most could not bear it. That's why we prefer to cling to fictions that help us move forward. Schopenhauer's fifth lesson is that intelligence is a curse. Most believe that thinking makes us free, that knowledge is an advantage, that reason elevates us above the rest. But for Schopenhauer, being conscious of the world is to realize the absurdity of existence. The more intelligent someone is, the more clearly they see the suffering, injustice, and lack of meaning that dominate life. Ignorance is a refuge, lucidity, a torment. The more intelligent a man is, the more he suffers, wrote Schopenhauer. Reason does not make us happy, but quite the opposite. It makes us aware that happiness is an illusion, that our desires will never be truly satisfied, that life is nothing more than an endless struggle against boredom and frustration. The less conscious live without asking too many questions, busy with routines and distractions. But whoever is unable to deceive themselves with empty hopes, whoever understands that every joy is temporary and every achievement is insignificant in the face of death, only finds despair in their lucidity. This is the paradox of intelligence. The more we understand, the less capable we are of enjoying life. Schopenhauer saw in art, music, and contemplation a way to temporarily alleviate this anguish, but not as a real solution, rather as a temporary distraction from the horror of existence. True peace only comes when we stop fighting against the inevitable, when we accept that knowledge will not save us, but will only make us more aware of the tragedy in which we are trapped. Schopenhauer's sixth lesson is that society is designed for the mediocre. Not because there is a conspiracy against brilliant minds, but because most people simply cannot bear the truth. We live surrounded by collective illusions, by norms created to keep people busy without asking too many questions. Happiness, progress, morality, family, work. Everything is structured to give the impression that life has meaning, so that no one has to face the absolute void. Schopenhauer despised the society of his time because he clearly saw how it worked. People do not seek truth, they seek comfort. They prefer to be distracted by banalities rather than reflect on the fact that nothing they do has any real meaning. Therefore, those who refuse to play the game, who see the falsity of institutions and social expectations, are often marginalized, treated as eccentrics or, worse, as crazy. Society is not made for those who think too much. It is made for those who accept their role without questioning it. The most ironic thing is that, despite his contempt for humanity, Schopenhauer understood that one cannot completely escape from society. We need others to survive, even though we know that most interactions are based on hypocrisy and self-deception. So, what option is left? For him, the only way out was voluntary isolation, the search for solitude as a refuge where thought could exist without the contamination of the outside world. The only way to bear life was by moving away from those who still believe in its lies. Schopenhauer's seventh lesson is that the will to live is a trap from which we can never escape. Everything we do, everything we feel, everything we yearn for is the product of a blind and irrational force that pushes us to exist without asking us why. We are not rational beings who freely decide their destiny. We are puppets of an impulse that forces us to desire, to fight, to move forward even when we know that everything is in vain. In The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer describes this force as the will, a fundamental principle that governs life without worrying about the suffering it causes. It is the reason we keep going even when we are exhausted, the reason hunger, desire, and fear dominate our existence. The will keeps us trapped in an endless cycle of needs and frustrations, making us believe that there is something at the end of the road when in reality there is only more of the same. The true horror is that there is no way to resist. We cannot simply turn off the will, stop desiring, abandon the struggle. The only way to escape is the total denial of life, something that few can achieve without falling into madness or absolute despair. That is why Schopenhauer saw in asceticism, in the rejection of worldly pleasures, and in the contemplation of art, a small crack in the prison of existence. Not because these things really free us, but because they allow us, if only for a moment, to see the world without the distortion of desire. Schopenhauer's eighth lesson is that death is not a tragedy, but the only possible liberation. If life is suffering, if desire is a condemnation, and happiness is an illusion, then death should not be seen as the end of something valuable, but as the only way to escape from an existence that never offered us anything lasting. There is no purpose behind life, so there is no real loss in its end. For Schopenhauer, the fear of death is another of the great deceptions of the will. It makes us cling to life even when it has shown us time and again that it will only bring pain and disappointment. But what sense is there in fearing nothingness? Death is the great opportunity to be no more, he wrote. There is no hell, no final judgment, no other life waiting for us. Just the return to the state we should never have left. The irony is that, although he saw death as the only real liberation, he did not advocate an impulsive surrender to it. Life may be misery, but fleeing from it prematurely only confirms the trap we are in. True wisdom, according to Schopenhauer, is to accept life for what it is, without illusions or false consolations, and to find a way to endure it until death comes on its own. In this sense, the greatest rebellion against the will to live is not to be dragged by its deceptions, not to despair over suffering or fall into absolute hopelessness. Schopenhauer's ninth and final lesson is that, despite everything, we are still here. We know that life is suffering, that happiness is a trap, that love is a biological deception, that society rewards mediocrity, that intelligence only makes us more unhappy, and that death is the only real escape. And yet, we continue breathing, we continue thinking, we continue moving forward, even though we know that everything will end in nothingness. Why? Schopenhauer does not offer us comforting answers, but in his brutality, there is a form of clarity. If the world is a hostile place, the only option is to accept it without false hopes. Not because this makes it less painful, but because it allows us to walk with our eyes open, without deceptions or empty promises. There is no final purpose, but that does not mean we cannot find moments of calm, of lucidity, even of beauty. In music, in art, in contemplation, in the ability to see the absurdity and laugh at it. Perhaps what remains for us is to learn to bear existence with dignity, to expect nothing from it, and yet to carry on. Not because there is a great reward at the end, but because somehow we have learned to resist. Life is a cruel joke, but who says we can't laugh too? And now that we have seen the world through Schopenhauer's eyes, what do you think? Do you accept his vision of existence, or do you believe there is something beyond this absolute pessimism?